Do you even know what you're bidding on? The question drifted across the auction hall with the kind of effortless arrogance that only money could buy. A few people chuckled. Others smiled into crystal glasses of sparkling water. Beneath a ceiling lined with cascading chandeliers, surrounded by polished marble floors and paintings worth more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime, Ava Brooks stood alone near the back row of the exclusive Whitmore and Lang luxury auction house in Manhattan. She heard the question. Everyone did. Yet no one seemed interested in whether she would answer. Their attention lingered on her simple navy dress, her modest handbag, and the fact that she looked nothing like the collectors, investors, and socialites who filled the room. Richard Whitmore leaned comfortably in his front row seat, a silver paddle resting across one knee. At 62, he carried the confidence of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted. The expensive watch peeking from beneath his tailored cuff probably cost more than Ava's annual salary. His blue eyes swept over her once before returning to the stage. The dismissal was subtle, practiced. Worse than an insult because it suggested she wasn't important enough to insult. Around him, several guests exchanged knowing glances. One woman whispered something behind a smile. Another adjusted her diamond bracelet while openly staring. The room had already made its judgment. Ava didn't belong here. She lowered her gaze briefly, not from embarrassment, but to steady herself. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bidder registration card tucked inside her purse. The thick cardstock felt heavier than it should have. For 12 years she had studied forgotten records, faded letters, and family histories hidden inside archives most people never visited. She had spent weekends in climate-controlled rooms turning fragile pages, while others spent theirs at brunches and charity galas. She knew what persistence felt like. She knew what it meant to be overlooked. And she knew exactly why she had come tonight. On stage, the auctioneer continued speaking as assistants adjusted spotlights over the evenings. Featured collections, rare paintings, antique jewelry, historical artifacts. Each item drew applause from the crowd. Each winning bid brought another wave of polite excitement. Yet Ava barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on a velvet-covered display concealed behind a black curtain near the center of the stage. That was the item she had traveled nearly 300 miles to see. The item no one else in the room understood the way she did. A server carrying a silver tray passed nearby. Ava accepted a glass of water and quietly thanked him. The young man offered a warm smile before moving on. It was one of the few genuine expressions she had seen all evening. As the next lot sold for nearly $2 million, applause echoed through the hall. Richard Whitmore barely reacted. He looked bored, as though wealth itself had become routine. Then the auctioneer's voice shifted. The room grew quieter. Conversations faded. The black curtain behind the stage began to move. Ava's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. For years she had imagined this moment. For years she had searched for answers hidden inside a story larger than herself. Around her, guests leaned forward with curiosity. Cameras flashed. Richard straightened in his chair for the first time all night. Whatever sat behind that curtain had captured the attention of every powerful person in the room. Ava lifted her eyes toward the stage. And for the first time that evening, she wasn't looking at the crowd at all. The curtain slid away with deliberate elegance, revealing a glass display case illuminated by a single beam of warm light. Inside rested an aged leather journal no larger than a hardcover novel. At first glance, it seemed almost underwhelming compared to the diamonds, sculptures, and rare paintings that had dominated the evening. Yet the room reacted immediately. Collectors shifted forward. Advisors whispered into their clients' ears. Several people reached for their auction catalogs at the same time. Ava Brooks did not move. She had seen photographs of the journal before. Grainy archive copies. Historical references buried inside university records. Mentions hidden within old estate documents that few people had bothered to read. But seeing it in person felt different. The worn leather cover carried the weight of nearly 2 centuries. Every crease seemed to contain a story. Every faded mark felt alive. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall. He explained that the journal dated back to the mid-19th century and had recently surfaced from a private collection in Virginia. Historians believed it documented daily life during a turbulent period of American history. The provenance was considered remarkable. The rarity was undeniable. As he spoke, a giant screen displayed enlarged images of several handwritten pages. Guests studied them with interest. Ava studied them with recognition. Her grandmother used to tell stories about a woman named Sarah Brooks. Not stories from textbooks. Family stories. Stories passed from one generation to the next around dinner tables and church gatherings. Most relatives treated them as oral history, fragments of memory carried through time. Ava had treated them differently. She had spent years testing every detail against records, census documents, and historical archives. Little by little, impossible stories became documented facts. What began as family curiosity became an obsession. Then it became her life's work. 3 years earlier, while researching at a historical archive outside Richmond, she had discovered a reference that changed everything. A librarian had helped her locate an inventory list from a private estate sale conducted more than 80 years ago. Buried among hundreds of entries was a single line mentioning a handwritten journal connected to the Brooks family. At the time the trail went cold. No owner. No location. No explanation. Just a record proving the journal had existed. Tonight it sat 30 feet away beneath bright auction lights. Ava slipped her hand into her purse and touched a folded photograph she carried everywhere. The edges had softened with age. The image showed her grandmother standing beside an elderly woman on a front porch in Georgia during the summer of 1968. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a family name that had appeared repeatedly throughout Ava's research. The same name mentioned inside historical references connected to the journal. Across the room, Richard Whitmore appeared increasingly interested. He adjusted his glasses and exchanged quiet words with an advisor seated beside him. Unlike many wealthy collectors, Richard rarely pursued items on impulse. If he wanted something, he usually arrived prepared. Ava noticed several familiar signs. The focused expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the confidence of someone who expected to leave with the winning bid. The auctioneer finally announced the opening price. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Paddles lifted almost immediately. The numbers began climbing. $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. Voices remained calm, but excitement filled the air like static before a storm. Ava watched the bids rise without reacting. Around her, people assumed she was merely observing. Another spectator enjoying the show. Another outsider watching wealth compete with wealth. None of them understood that every number called from the stage pushed the journal closer to disappearing again. And Ava Brooks had not traveled 300 miles simply to watch history leave her family twice. The bidding climbed steadily. Each new offer announced with the polished confidence of people accustomed to spending extraordinary amounts of money. $125,000 became $150,000. $150 became $200. The auctioneer's voice remained smooth and measured, but the energy inside the room shifted with every increase. What had started as polite interest was becoming a competition. Ava stood perfectly still, listening. The glow from the display case reflected softly across the polished floor, and the journal remained at the center of every gaze in the room. For many bidders, it represented prestige. For others, it represented investment potential. For Richard Whitmore, it appeared to represent conquest. He raised his paddle almost casually whenever another collector challenged him. There was no hesitation, no visible concern. Each movement seemed practiced as though winning was simply part of his routine. Several guests watched him with admiration. Others watched him with resignation. They had seen this before. Richard entered a room, identified what he wanted, and eventually left with it. Ava noticed the pattern immediately. The advisor seated beside him occasionally leaned over to whisper information, but Richard rarely needed guidance. He had already researched the item. He already understood its market value. What he did not understand was its personal value. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. The auctioneer announced $275,000. A murmur swept through the audience. One bidder dropped out. Then another. The field narrowed quickly. Ava looked toward the enlarged image displayed on the screen behind the stage. One page of the journal had been opened for viewing. The handwriting flowed across the yellowed paper in elegant lines. Most people saw historical penmanship. Ava saw something else. During years of research, She had studied dozens of letters preserved by descendants connected to her family history. Certain writing habits repeated themselves across generations. The way specific letters curved, the spacing between words. Small details most people would never notice. Details she had spent years learning to recognize. Her pulse quickened slightly, not because of the price, because of certainty. For the first time in her life, she was looking directly at something she had only imagined. Across the room, a woman seated near the front quietly asked another guest who Ava was. The second woman shrugged. Neither knew. A man in a charcoal suit glanced toward Ava and then looked away again. To them, she remained an anonymous observer. Someone who had somehow wandered into a room where she did not belong. Their assumptions floated through the air without words. Ava had encountered that feeling before. At academic conferences. In archives. During meetings where people questioned her expertise before hearing her speak. She no longer carried anger about it. Experience had taught her something more valuable than anger. Patience. The auctioneer called out $300,000. Applause followed. Richard smiled faintly and adjusted his posture. Several competitors were gone now. Only a few remained. The atmosphere felt tighter. More focused. The room that had once ignored Ava barely noticed her existence even now. Their attention remained fixed on wealth, status, and influence. They were watching familiar players move through familiar motions. None of them noticed Ava reaching slowly into her purse. Her fingers wrapped around the bitter paddle she had collected at registration hours earlier. The white card felt cool against her hand. She looked once more toward the journal beneath the lights. She thought about her grandmother's stories. The countless hours spent reading records after long workdays. The years of searching that had brought her here. Then she lifted her eyes toward the stage. The auctioneer announced a new bid. Silence settled over the hall for a brief moment as everyone waited to see who would answer next. And for the first time all evening, Ava Brooks tightened her grip on the paddle. A voice from the front offered $325,000. The auctioneer nodded immediately and repeated the amount for the room. Several heads turned toward the bidder. A few people whispered. The competition had become serious now. The casual spectators were gone. Only determined buyers remained. Richard Whitmore glanced toward the challenger and calmly lifted his paddle again. $350,000. The number echoed beneath the chandeliers. A small wave of approval moved through the audience. Richard settled back comfortably in his seat, appearing almost relaxed. He had done this countless times. He understood the rhythm of auctions. Pressure competitors. Control momentum. Force hesitation. Most people eventually stepped aside. The auctioneer scanned the room. $350,000. Looking for $375,000. Silence followed. The challenger hesitated. A few seconds passed. Then the paddle lowered. The room seemed to exhale. Richard's expression barely changed, but satisfaction flickered behind his eyes. It appeared the contest was ending. The auctioneer smiled. Politely. $350,000. Going once. He paused and swept his gaze across the audience. Going twice. Ava felt the weight of the paddle in her hand. Around her, people were already preparing for the next lot. Some reached for their drinks. Others checked their phones. The evening was moving on. The journal was about to disappear again. Her grandmother's voice seemed to return from years ago. Stories shared on humid Georgia evenings. Stories about names, families, and memories that survived, because someone refused to let them be forgotten. Ava drew a slow breath. Then she raised her paddle. The movement was simple, quiet, almost invisible. Yet the effect was immediate. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. Several nearby guests blinked in surprise. For a moment nobody spoke. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses and looked toward the back of the room. $375,000. Thank you, ma'am. The silence shattered into whispers. Heads turned. Conversation sparked instantly. The woman who had spent the entire evening unnoticed suddenly became the center of attention. Ava lowered the paddle and stood calmly. Her face revealed nothing. Richard turned around. This time he looked directly at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. His expression remained polite, but confusion lingered beneath it. He clearly did not recognize her. Neither did anyone else. A man near the aisle leaned toward his companion. Another guest glanced at Ava's registration badge, as though searching for an explanation. The room wanted context. Wealthy people often expected information before they accepted surprises. Richard recovered quickly. He raised his paddle again. $400,000. The audience responded with renewed energy. The competition was alive once more. Ava listened, waited, then lifted her paddle again. $425,000. More whispers followed. The auctioneer repeated the bid with growing excitement. What had been a predictable sale was becoming the most interesting moment of the evening. Cameras that had drifted toward other parts of the room turned back toward the stage. Several guests sat straighter in their chairs. Richard's advisor leaned over and quietly spoke into his ear. Richard listened without taking his eyes off Ava. She could feel the attention now, the curiosity, the assumptions. People were trying to solve a puzzle they did not understand. Some likely assumed she represented an investor. Others probably believed she was bidding on behalf of a collector who preferred anonymity. Very few considered the possibility that she was acting entirely on her own. Richard raised his paddle once more. $450,000. His voice remained calm when he confirmed the bid. Yet the ease that had defined him earlier seemed slightly diminished. For the first time all evening, he was no longer competing against familiar rivals. He was competing against a woman whose story he did not know. Ava looked toward the journal again. The leather cover glowed softly beneath the display lights. She remembered every mile she had driven to reach New York, every archive box she had opened, every document she had searched. Then she lifted her paddle again without hesitation, and the room fell silent. $475,000. The auctioneer's voice rang through the hall, followed by a wave of murmurs that rolled across the audience like wine through tall grass. No one was pretending to ignore Ava anymore. Every eye seemed to find her. The woman who had arrived unnoticed now stood at the center of the evening's most unexpected contest. Richard Whitmore remained seated in the front row, but something about his posture had changed. Earlier he had looked comfortable, certain. Now he looked focused. The kind of focus that appeared when a person realized a situation was no longer unfolding according to plan. His advisor leaned closer again and quietly spoke into his ear. Richard nodded once without responding. His attention never left Ava. The auctioneer glanced toward the front row. $475,000. Do I hear 500,000? Richard lifted his paddle immediately. $500,000. Several guests reacted audibly. A woman near the center table placed a hand against her chest. Another guest shook his head in amazement. The amount had moved far beyond what many expected. Yet Richard appeared unfazed. To him, the number was simply another step. Another move in a game he intended to win. Ava listened carefully as the bid echoed through the room. $500,000. A figure large enough to purchase a home in many parts of the country. Large enough to transform lives. Yet when she looked at the journal, the number felt strangely small compared to what was at stake. She thought about her grandmother again. About evenings spent listening to stories many people dismissed as impossible to verify. Stories about resilience, separation, and memory. Stories carried forward because somebody believed they mattered. For years, Ava had worked in museum archives where forgotten histories sat quietly in acid-free boxes. She had learned something there. History did not disappear all at once. It vanished piece by piece whenever people stopped protecting it. She raised her paddle. $525,000. The room erupted into whispers once more. A man near the back quietly laughed in disbelief. Another guest turned around fully in his chair just to get a better look at her. The auctioneer's excitement became impossible to hide. He repeated the bid with visible enthusiasm. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Surprise. Perhaps even curiosity. He studied Ava for several seconds before looking back toward the stage. Then he raised his paddle again. $550,000. The number landed heavily. A few people applauded. Others exchanged uncertain glances. What began as entertainment was becoming something more serious. More personal. The tension in the room no longer revolved around money alone. It revolved around a question nobody could answer. Why was she willing to keep going? Ava could almost hear the assumptions forming around her. Maybe she represented a wealthy collector. Maybe she was acting for a museum. Maybe she had access to resources nobody expected. The truth was far simpler and far more powerful. She understood what the journal meant. That understanding could not be measured by market estimates or investment projections. Richard slowly turned toward his advisor again. This conversation lasted longer. The advisor opened a folder and pointed toward several pages. Richard reviewed the information carefully. Around them, guests watched with fascination. Some people had come hoping to witness a record-breaking sale. Instead, they were watching certainty collide with determination. The auctioneer called for the next bid. Silence followed. Ava looked down briefly and opened her purse. Inside rested the folded photograph she always carried. She touched the worn corner for just a moment. The image had traveled hundreds of miles with her. Through years of research. Through dead ends and discoveries. Through every moment that led here. Then she closed the purse, lifted her eyes, and heard Richard offer $600,000. The hall fell quiet again. Every face turned toward Ava. Waiting. Watching. Wondering if this was finally the moment she would stop. $600,000 hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. No one spoke. Even the soft clink of glassware seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Ava Brooks stood quietly near the back of the room, her paddle lowered at her side. The auction hall that had once overlooked her now seemed suspended around her. Hundreds of tiny crystal reflections drifted across the marble floor beneath the chandeliers. The golden display lights illuminated the journal inside its glass case, making the worn leather glow softly against the darkness behind it. Ava looked at it without blinking. She barely noticed the crowd anymore. The whispers, the speculation, the curiosity, all of it felt distant. For years she had imagined what would happen if she ever found this journal. In those dreams there had never been an auction, never a room filled with wealthy collectors, never cameras or reporters or million-dollar bids. In her imagination, discovery had always happened quietly. A dusty archive, forgotten box, a librarian carrying records across a reading room. Reality had chosen a different path. Somewhere deep inside her purse rested the folded photograph she had carried for years. The edges had become soft from being handled so often. Her grandmother had once told her that memory was like a candle. One person carried the flame and passed it to another. If nobody protected it, the light disappeared. Ava remembered those words now. She remembered sitting on a porch in Georgia as evening settled across the fields. She remembered listening while older relatives spoke about people whose names never appeared in textbooks. People who survived hardship, separation, uncertainty, and time itself. Most families passed down jewelry or property. Ava's family had passed down stories. The journal represented proof that those stories had lived somewhere beyond memory. Across the room, Richard Whitmore remained perfectly still. Earlier he had looked like a man attending another successful evening. Now he looked thoughtful. The confidence remained, but something else had entered his expression. Respect perhaps. Curiosity certainly. He no longer watched Ava as an interruption. He watched her as a competitor. His advisor whispered another recommendation. Richard listened carefully. Then he nodded and folded the papers resting in his lap. Around them, guests waited for someone to move. Some expected Richard to continue. Others expected Ava to step away. The uncertainty created a strange silence that settled over the room like snowfall. The auctioneer cleared his throat softly. $600,000. He repeated the amount with professional calm, but even he seemed reluctant to disturb the moment. Ava drew a slow breath. The cool air carried faint traces of polished wood, old books, and expensive perfume. She closed her eyes for a second. Not to think about money. Not to think about winning. To remember why she had come. When she opened them again, the journal remained beneath the lights. Unmoved. Waiting. And for the first time that evening, she felt something stronger than determination. She felt peace. The silence finally broke when Richard Whitmore lifted his paddle again. $625,000. A collective breath moved through the hall. The amount appeared on the screen beside the stage, glowing in white numbers against a dark background. Several guests exchanged astonished looks. Others simply stared at Ava, waiting to see what she would do next. Yet before the auctioneer could continue, a voice emerged from the side of the stage. One of the historical consultants assigned to the sale stepped forward carrying a thin folder. He spoke quietly to the auctioneer, who listened with growing interest. The room shifted with curiosity. This was not part of the usual process. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses and addressed the audience. Before proceeding, he said, "Our historical team has requested clarification regarding newly verified information connected to this item." Murmurs spread immediately. Richard frowned slightly. Ava remained still. The consultant opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. Earlier this afternoon, he explained, additional research confirmed that the journal's author has been positively identified. Historians had previously believed the writer's identity was uncertain. That is no longer the case. The giant screen behind the stage changed. A scanned image of an aged document appeared. Then another. Then a family record. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. She recognized some of the material immediately. The consultant continued. The journal was written by Sarah Brooks, an African-American woman whose personal account has been referenced in multiple historical archives, but was long considered lost. Several people in the audience sat straighter. Others leaned forward. The consultant displayed another image. A signature appeared enlarged across the screen. Elegant. Distinctive. Familiar. Ava had seen that name hundreds of times during her research. The consultant smiled softly. What makes this discovery especially significant is that surviving descendants of Sarah Brooks are still living today. The room became completely silent. Ava could hear nothing except the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The consultant looked toward the back of the hall. Then, with gentle respect, he said, "One of those descendants appears to be present this evening." Every head turned. This time there was no confusion about where people were looking. The attention of the entire room settled on Ava Brooks. Not because of her bid. Not because of her clothing. Not because she had challenged a billionaire. Because suddenly her presence made sense. Richard Whitmore slowly lowered his paddle. His expression changed completely. The puzzle he had spent the evening trying to solve finally revealed itself. Ava was not pursuing an investment. She was not representing a secret buyer. She was standing in front of a piece of her family's history. The consultant displayed one final image. A family photograph provided during authentication research. Ava recognized it instantly. It was the same photograph she carried inside her purse. A quiet gasp swept through the audience. For the first time all evening, nobody seemed interested in the price. The numbers no longer mattered. The room had spent hours measuring the journal's financial value. Now they were beginning to understand its human value. Richard looked toward Ava again. There was no arrogance left in his gaze. Only respect. The auctioneer stood silently for several seconds before speaking. $625,000 is the current bid. He paused and glanced toward Ava. But somehow the evening had become about far more than money. No one moved for several seconds. The auction hall felt transformed, as though the room itself had finally understood something it had missed all evening. The journal remained beneath the display lights, but the attention surrounding it had changed completely. What had begun as a contest over ownership had become a story about connection. Richard Whitmore slowly set his paddle down on the armrest beside him. The small gesture was enough to trigger another wave of whispers throughout the audience. People who had spent the evening admiring wealth now found themselves studying Ava Brooks instead. Not because of the money she had offered. Because they were beginning to understand why she had been willing to offer it. The auctioneer looked toward Richard respectfully. "Sir, would you like to continue?" Richard remained silent for a moment. His eyes drifted from the journal to the enlarged photograph displayed on the screen. Then to Ava. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "How long have you been searching for it?" The question carried through the room. Ava had not expected it. Neither had anyone else. She hesitated briefly before answering. "Most of my adult life." The honesty of the response settled over the audience. There was no performance in her voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Just truth. Richard nodded slowly. And you knew what it was the moment it appeared tonight? Ava looked toward the display case. Yes, I hoped I was right. But when I saw the handwriting, I knew. The room fell quiet again. Richard leaned back in his chair and released a long breath. For years he had collected historical artifacts. He often spoke about preserving the past, protecting stories, honoring history. Yet standing there was a woman who had done exactly that without wealth, influence, or recognition. She had protected a story because it belonged to her family, because it mattered. Richard stood from his seat. The movement immediately drew every eye in the room. Some guests expected another bid. Others expected an argument. Instead, he turned toward the auctioneer. I withdraw. A collective gasp swept through the hall. The words seemed almost impossible. Richard Whitmore was not known for surrendering prized acquisitions. Yet his expression showed no regret, only certainty. He looked directly at Ava. Some things belong in collections, he said quietly. And some things belong with the people who carried them through history. The silence that followed felt different from every silence earlier that evening. Softer. Warmer. Ava felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because she had won. Because for the first time all night someone else understood. The auctioneer smiled gently before raising his gavel. The journal would go to Ava Brooks. Applause began somewhere near the middle of the room. Then another person joined. Then another. Within moments the entire hall stood filled with applause. Not the polite applause reserved for expensive purchases. Something deeper. Recognition. Respect. Ava remained where she was, holding the paddle at her side. She did not celebrate. She did not raise her hands or make a speech. She simply looked toward the journal resting beneath the lights and thought about all the people who had carried its story forward long enough for it to find its way home. 3 months later, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Georgia Center for African American History. The morning air carried the quiet sounds of school groups arriving, teachers organizing students, and volunteers preparing exhibits before opening hours. Near the center of the museum stood a climate-controlled glass display illuminated by soft golden light. Inside rested the journal, not hidden in a private collection, not locked away behind the doors of an estate. Accessible, preserved, shared. Children moved slowly past the exhibit, reading the information panels mounted beside the glass. Some pointed toward the handwritten pages displayed on enlarged screens. Others listened as guides explained the significance of the discovery. For many visitors, it was an important historical artifact. For Ava Brooks, it was something more. She stood quietly near the back of the gallery, hands folded in front of her, watching people interact with a story that had nearly disappeared. Nobody recognized her immediately. She preferred it that way. The attention surrounding the auction had faded weeks ago. News articles had moved on to newer stories. The cameras were gone. The headlines were gone. What remained was the history itself. A young girl stopped in front of the display and carefully read every word on the plaque. Her mother waited nearby. After several minutes, the girl looked up and asked a question. The mother smiled and began explaining. Ava could not hear the conversation from where she stood, but she could see the curiosity in the child's eyes. That was enough. Across the room, another visitor paused before a framed photograph included in the exhibit. It showed several generations of the Brooks family. Beside it rested copies of research notes, archival records, and documents that had helped connect the journal to its rightful history. Years of work condensed into a few display cases. Years of searching transformed into understanding. Ava walked slowly toward the exhibit. The polished floor reflected the warm afternoon light streaming through the windows. She stopped in front of the glass and looked at the familiar leather cover resting inside. For a moment, she remembered the auction hall. The whispers, the assumptions, the feeling of standing alone in a room full of strangers. Then she remembered something else. Richard Whitmore's decision. The moment respect replaced judgment. A small bronze plaque near the display carried a simple acknowledgement thanking everyone who had contributed to preserving the journal for public education. Richard's name appeared among them. So did the names of historians, archivists, museum staff, and community supporters. History, Ava realized, survived because many people chose to protect it. Not just one. A reflection appeared faintly in the glass. Her own face. Behind it, the journal. behind that nearly 2 centuries of memory. She placed one hand lightly against her heart and stood there for several seconds. No speeches, no applause, no cameras, just quiet. Around her, children continued learning. Teachers continued teaching. Stories continued moving forward. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the old oak trees lining the museum grounds. Sunlight shifted across the floor in slow patterns. Ava smiled softly and stepped back. The journal had finally found its way home. And in the peaceful silence of the gallery, it felt as though every voice that carried its story through generations could finally rest.